Many believe that what drives a man wild is what he sees, the appearance, the body, the smile, the way of speaking. But that's just the surface. What truly destabilizes him, what seeps into his mind like a silent obsession, isn't visible. It's something that touches a point he himself can't name. Because a man's deepest desire doesn't arise from what's explicit, but from what challenges him in the invisible. Carl Jung said that much of our most intense decisions aren't conscious. Love, desire, attraction, all of these are governed by internal forces we don't control. Memories, traumas, symbols, archetypes form a silent yet powerful psychic web, and it's within this web that unconscious desire is born. A man might have hundreds of interactions with incredible women, but in a specific moment, in the presence of a specific woman, he feels something he doesn't understand, and that's what hooks him. This kind of attraction isn't logical. He can't explain it, but he feels it, because something in that woman triggers an ancient code within him, an emotional memory that has no image but carries weight. It's as if his unconscious says, "Pay attention to this." From then on, he starts thinking about her more than he'd like, recalling small details, creating scenarios in his mind he didn't expect. It's not what she does, it's what she stirs. What stirs this isn't always beauty or charm, it's something subtler. Jung called it projection. The man sees in her something he's lost, something he longs to rediscover, or something he never had and wishes he did. Sometimes it's a kind of strength. Other times it's freedom, lightness, a silence that calms or unsettles. But there's always one thing in common. This woman represents, to his unconscious, something he hasn't managed to build within himself. When this happens, it doesn't matter if he's just met her or known her for years. That image transforms. That presence takes on a new meaning, and he starts moving toward her without knowing why. It's not about control. It's about activation. The activation of a desire that isn't of the body, but of the psyche. This kind of desire is the most dangerous, because it can't be manipulated or rushed. It's born where control can't reach. That's why so often a man pulls away from women who treat him well, who are stable and safe, yet finds himself completely absorbed by someone who doesn't even try. It's not about games. It's about energetic presence, the energy that communicates before words, the silent force that awakens an unresolved conflict within him. Jung understood that what we seek in another is always a reflection of what we need to integrate in ourselves. So when a man feels inexplicably drawn to a woman, it's because something in her represents a missing piece of his own identity. It might be something he lost in childhood, something he never allowed himself to feel, or a pain he doesn't know how to heal, but his unconscious recognizes it. And when that happens, he no longer sees that woman with ordinary eyes. He sees her through the lens of lack. That's the key, because a woman who activates this place, without trying, without forcing, without playing a role, enters his mind deeply. Not because she's trying to seduce, but because she awakens an emotional memory. She makes him feel like he's facing something he needs to understand. And until he does, he won't let go. Even if he rationally says it doesn't make sense, emotionally he's already been captured. That's why unconscious desire is so powerful. It transforms how a man moves. He starts trying to get closer, to understand, to decipher. Sometimes it breeds fear. Other times it leads to flight. But there's always an impact, because it's not about what's outside. It's about what's been activated within. What drives a man to lose himself over a woman, at its core, isn't what she shows. It's what she awakens. And when that happens, his internal rhythm shifts. Even if outwardly he pretends to be in control, his mind will never be the same. When a man starts feeling irrationally drawn to a woman, something silent begins to work within him. It's not just desire. It's not mere wanting. It's an invisible force that starts taking up space in his mind, his emotions, his recurring thoughts. He might not talk about it. He might even act like nothing's happening, but it is. And what's happening isn't small. It's an internal movement that binds him in a way he can't explain. This force doesn't come from the present moment. It's shaped by everything that came before, by how he learned to love, by what he saw in his parents, by the absences he carried from childhood, by the frustrations he never voiced. And without knowing it, he connects with someone who effortlessly activates all of this. It's as if she's a key to a locked part of his unconscious, a part that was there, waiting to be accessed. Carl Jung spoke of the concept of a complex, a cluster of emotions, memories and symbols tied to an unresolved emotional experience. These complexes live in the unconscious, and when triggered, they take over how we act. A man might be strong, successful, rational, but when a complex is touched, he loses his neutrality. He starts reacting emotionally without knowing why, and often the trigger is a person, someone who, unknowingly, represents that hidden wound. This representation isn't something the woman does intentionally. She simply carries, in her way of being, a signal his unconscious recognizes. It might be a look, an emotional absence, a steady presence, a calm voice, or an emotional intensity. Something connects to his past, and that connection becomes a bond. This bond isn't visible, but it's real, and it's what makes him feel drawn to her in a disproportionate way. He doesn't know if it's love, he doesn't know if it's obsession, but he feels it. And for the unconscious, feeling is stronger than knowing. The mind might try to dismiss it, but the body reacts, the emotional memory responds, dreams shift, internal energy changes. This is where many women wonder, why did he disappear? Why did he get so close and then vanish? The answer might lie in this invisible force. When attraction touches something too deep, fear awakens too. Fear of losing control, fear of repeating a pain, fear of being emotionally exposed. And that's when many men pull back, not because they don't feel, but because they feel too much. For someone unaccustomed to handling their own emotions, that's terrifying. The truth is, many men were taught not to feel, to control, to rationalize, to avoid vulnerability. Then suddenly a woman comes along who cuts through all of that without asking permission. She activates something that was dormant. And this creates an internal restlessness he can't name, but can't ignore either. The force that binds a man in this case isn't the woman herself. It's what she represents to his soul. It's how she touches, unintentionally, a point he hasn't resolved. This invisible force is psychic, symbolic, emotional, and until he understands what's happening, he won't find peace. That's why many men come back, even after pulling away, even after saying they want nothing. They return because the force pulling them isn't external, it's internal. And until it's integrated, the cycle repeats. This invisible force is what turns a simple connection into a lasting experience. It's what makes a woman unforgettable, not because of what she did, but because she accessed a place he'd been avoiding. And once that place is touched, he's never the same. Now he's in conflict, and that conflict, even wordlessly, begins to shape every step he takes. In a world where everything seems to revolve around appearance, it's easy to believe that what drives a man wild for a woman lies in her facial features, her body's curves, or how she dresses. But when it comes to true attraction, the kind that cuts through the surface and settles into the unconscious, the story is different. What really moves a man, in a way he can't explain, is the energy a woman carries. It's not what she shows, it's what she radiates. This energy isn't forced, it isn't rehearsed, it can't be learned in a class. It comes from the relationship a woman has with herself. When a woman is at peace with who she is, when she doesn't beg for love, when she doesn't try to prove her worth, the field around her shifts. She becomes magnetic. And the most striking thing is that it has nothing to do with perfection. Often this woman carries scars, insecurities, tough stories, but she doesn't fight them. She acknowledges them. And that acknowledgement is what makes her energy real. Carl Jung spoke of the power of archetypes, primal images that dwell in the collective unconscious. A woman who taps into her authenticity unknowingly activates the archetype of the integrated feminine. She doesn't need to shout. She doesn't need to compete. Her presence says it all. And when a man encounters this energy, something inside him awakens, a desire that isn't just physical but symbolic, a desire that comes from the soul. This kind of desire doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't invade, it draws in. It doesn't demand, it suggests. And that's precisely why it's so strong, because it doesn't try to trap, because it doesn't need to convince. A woman who taps into this energy doesn't chase. And that's exactly why a man starts chasing her, even without understanding why. The energy that awakens true desire is deeply tied to a sense of self-worth. When a woman knows what she deserves, when she's clear about what she will or won't accept, she stops being available for just anything. And that unavailability creates an impact, because we live in a culture where many people give themselves away out of fear of being alone. When someone breaks that pattern, they stand out effortlessly. A man feels this. Even if he can't put it into words, he senses when he's in the presence of someone who doesn't need him to feel complete. And that lack of neediness touches something ancient within him, a call, an unconscious memory of a feminine that doesn't need to dominate or be dominated, a feminine that simply is. This energy isn't tied to doing something specific, it's tied to an internal state, to how a woman treats herself when she's alone, to what she thinks of herself when no one's watching, to how she stands up to what doesn't respect her. And this state of presence, this level of awareness, is what transforms the field around her. It's what transforms how she walks, how she looks, how she responds, how she withdraws. That's why so many women get frustrated when they try to be desired through external effort. Because real desire isn't sparked by strategy, but by truth. A man might look at many women, but he'll only feel the impact when his energy is touched. And that only happens when the feminine energy is clear, steady, and serene. At this point, the game changes, because it's no longer about trying to be loved. It's about being whole. And that wholeness creates the strongest bond of all. One that doesn't come from need, but from choice. The energy that awakens true desire is quiet, but when it touches, it stays. There's a vast difference between being desired and being chosen, and that difference doesn't lie in what a woman offers, but in what she represents. Many men desire, but few have the depth to truly choose. And when a man's unconscious, encounters a woman who isn't for sale, not for affection, not for promises, not out of fear of being alone, something inside him shifts in a way he doesn't even comprehend. Carl Jung said that the unconscious expresses itself through symbols, not logic. And when a woman carries the energy of "I won't trade myself for anyone," it becomes a symbol of strength, of centeredness, of roots. She might be open to love, but she doesn't abandon herself for it. And that's rare. Because in a world where so many relationships are built on neediness, emotional bargaining, and the urge to please, meeting someone who doesn't bend has a profound impact. The masculine unconscious recognizes this strength, not because it shouts, but because it endures. It endures steady when they call her difficult. It stays calm when they try to manipulate her with silence, absence, or empty promises. It remains connected to itself, even when she feels something intense, because she's learned that intensity doesn't justify self-abandonment. And this endurance reveals something fundamental. She's not there out of desperation. She's there by choice. And it's precisely this freedom that disrupts the most common unconscious games. Because when a woman isn't for sale, she dismantles the emotional system of someone used to buying presents with crumbs of attention. She disables unconscious patterns of domination, control, and flight. She forces the other, without meaning, to look at themselves. Men who've been in relationships with women who gave themselves out of fear often don't know how to handle one who gives herself out of awareness. Because she doesn't cling, she doesn't chase, she doesn't push. And that throws off anyone who's always held control through conditional affection. The unconscious, accustomed to repetition, collapses in the face of something new. And the novelty here is a woman who loves herself more than she loves the idea of a relationship. Jung spoke of the meeting of opposites as an invitation to integration. When an unconscious man encounters a woman who isn't for sale, he has two options. He either rises to meet her or he flees to avoid confrontation. Because she'll stir in him everything he's hidden. She'll show without saying a word how much he's still trapped in childish patterns. And more than that, she'll highlight what he doesn't yet have the structure to sustain. But that's not her fault, because the feminine isn't here to heal the masculine. It's here to be whole. And when it's whole, it provokes healing, not by sacrificing itself, but by respecting itself. A man who feels this, even if he can't put it into words, he knows that woman won't beg, that she won't play games, that she won't let herself be molded to fit shallow affections. The feminine that isn't for sale brings peace and truth, but it also brings discomfort to those still caught in emotional games. It reveals the difference between being with someone out of fear of loneliness and being with someone out of true choice. And this kind of woman who doesn't trade herself, doesn't explain herself, and doesn't fragment to fit, awakens in a man a desire that isn't just of the body, but of presence, not because she hides, but because she preserves herself. There's an energy that doesn't shout, doesn't impose itself, doesn't justify, it simply is. And precisely because of that, it has a greater impact than any effort to demonstrate value. The woman who doesn't need to prove how good, worthy, or enough she is has already understood something many are still trying to grasp. Value isn't begged for, it's recognized. Carl Jung said that the unconscious picks up what lies beyond words. When a woman enters a relationship trying to convince someone she deserves love, what she actually communicates is doubt, because those who are certain don't argue, and those who are centered don't strive to be seen. They already are. This kind of presence sparks a different type of attraction in a man, an attraction not based on appearance, effort, or neediness, but on what she conveys even in silence. He may not rationally understand it, but his unconscious senses it. This woman is whole, and a whole woman doesn't fragment herself to be accepted. The need to prove worth stems from old wounds, from moments when love was conditional, from relationships where acceptance hinged on performance, obedience, or sacrifice. And when a woman still carries this unknowingly, she approaches every new relationship feeling she must do something extra, as if true love were a prize to be won rather than a recognition. But the woman who heals these roots no longer enters, trying to impress. She doesn't need to show she's strong, loyal, or special, because she knows, and when she knows, everything changes. The space she occupies already communicates who she is. And that's exactly why a man feels something beyond logic. He realizes he's not facing someone who needs him to feel loved. This lack of emotional dependency creates a dual effect. First, it commands respect. Second, it inspires admiration. Because it's rare, and everything rare leaves a mark, the woman who doesn't need to prove anything is remembered. She doesn't compete. She doesn't compare. She doesn't react with desperation when someone pulls away, because she doesn't see it as a reflection of her worth. She sees it as the other person's movement. And if they want to leave, she lets them go, not because she's cold, but because she's too whole to cling where there's no reciprocity. This stance triggers an internal confrontation in a man. He senses that if he's not genuine, if he lacks intention, if he's not truly present, he won't sustain the connection. Because she doesn't chase. And not because she's proud, but because she's too busy caring for herself to run after someone who doesn't know how to stay. Carl Jung said relationships are paths to individuation, self-knowledge, and few things teach us more about ourselves than encountering someone who doesn't bend, doesn't beg, and doesn't settle for crumbs. When a man meets a woman like this, he must decide, will he grow to meet her or step back to avoid the confrontation? There's no middle ground, and it's this very energy that drives a man wild, not out of desire, but out of impact. Because she doesn't need him, she chooses him. And being chosen by someone who needs no one is one of the most powerful experiences a man can have. There's no bargaining, no emotional blackmail, no strategy, just truth. And truth, even when silent, always speaks louder. Something happens, almost imperceptibly, when a woman stops fighting for attention, validation, or answers. When she quiets the need to constantly explain, justify, or make the other person see her, at that exact moment, she shifts her frequency, and the impact of that shift is immediate, even if the other person doesn't consciously grasp what's happening. Carl Jung said that everything repressed eventually manifests, but the opposite is also true. What's resolved internally stops, repeating externally. And when a woman resolves within herself that she no longer needs to prove she's worthy of love, her relationships change too. Because the absence of effort reveals what no argument can: certainty. The woman who no longer insists, who no longer chases, who no longer humiliates herself for attention, isn't doing it to play games. She's doing it because she's looked at herself honestly in the mirror. She's faced what hurt. She's seen herself in pieces and chosen to put herself back together slowly, carefully, truthfully. And those who walk this inner path no longer accept relationships that demand sacrifice to earn love. A man approaching her notices a firmness in how she carries herself. She can listen with empathy, but won't tolerate disrespect. She can open up, but won't abandon herself to please. She might feel fear, but won't negotiate her boundaries. And that's exactly what disarms any attempt at emotional manipulation. The absence of effort becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, the other person sees themselves clearly. If he came expecting to find someone to dominate, manipulate, or control, he realizes that won't work, because she doesn't play the game. She doesn't join the dance of pleasing to be accepted. She doesn't buy into the logic of proving she deserves to stay. This stirs something deep in the masculine psyche, a call to truth, because now everything he does must come from a real place. He can no longer rely on her neediness, her doubt, her insecurity. She won't beg, she won't dramatize, she won't try to convince him to stay. And that's when he realizes, either he shows up fully, or she'll walk away quietly. This stance of a woman who no longer needs to convince anyone, who simply exists in her own truth, is transformative, not just for her, but for everyone around her. Because when a woman stops diminishing herself, she forces others to see her more deeply, and those who don't want to see simply won't be able to stay. Jung explained that the shadow isn't just the dark side of our personality, it's everything we haven't yet integrated. And a woman who's integrated her shadow no longer needs external approval to feel valid. She's recognized what she hid. She's embraced the pain that once made her beg for affection. And this inner reconciliation shifts the entire energy of how she relates. It's not about being cold. It's not about being distant. It's about reaching a point where her presence alone is enough, where there's no more rush, desperation, or need to force connections, where she can simply observe, feel, and step away without fanfare when she sees the other isn't truly available. And the most striking thing is that this is when she becomes most magnetic, because what attracts isn't effort, it's presence. And full presence only exists when a woman stops chasing, when she learns that those who see, see, and those who don't, it's not her job to teach them. This absence of effort is, paradoxically, her greatest power, because someone who knows their own worth doesn't exhaust themselves proving anything. And when that happens, the other person feels, even without being able to explain, that this time he's facing someone who doesn't bend, doesn't mold herself, doesn't sell out. He's facing someone real. There's a point in a woman's emotional journey where something fundamental shifts. She stops living to be chosen. For Jung, this transition marks a decisive moment in the process of individuation, the instant when inner identity no longer depends on external validation. From then on, love isn't a quest for approval. It's a reflection of her own emotional maturity. For a long time, many women grow up believing their worth is tied to their ability to be desired, loved, chosen by someone. This conditioning starts early, subtle but pervasive, becoming an invisible mold. Being chosen is validation. Being rejected is a sign something's wrong with her. And so begins a silent cycle of insecurity, where self-esteem fluctuates with the crumbs she's given. But when this woman embarks on an inner journey of awareness, something starts to dissolve. She begins to see how often she shaped herself to fit, how many times she gave in to avoid being left, how often she erased herself out of fear of being too much. And in this confrontation with her own story, a new kind of exhaustion emerges, not physical, but existential, a deep weariness from carrying the weight of always trying to be enough. That's when her energy shifts. The woman who no longer needs to be chosen because she's chosen herself starts moving from a different place. She no longer lives to fit into someone else's desire. She lives in alignment with what she feels, thinks, and needs. And this transforms the dynamic of her relationships. This woman no longer romanticizes crumbs. She doesn't idealize promises. She isn't moved by empty gestures, because now she reads the signs clearly. She doesn't force presence where there's absence. She doesn't beg for attention from someone who's perpetually absent. She doesn't trade what she's built within herself with such effort for anything less. And that dismantles the game, because what the other person senses is a difference he can't name. He realizes this time he's not dealing with someone starved for affection, but someone whole. And wholeness unnerves those used to controlling, manipulating, or feeding off others' doubt. With this woman, that doesn't work, because she's crossed her own abysses, and someone who's survived herself no longer fears being alone. The key woman who's chosen herself understands that love isn't something to be won at any cost. It's a meeting of two who recognize each other, not a silent competition where she must prove she's the best option. This clarity lets her move with lightness. She doesn't beg for reciprocity. She doesn't cling where there's no depth. She doesn't stay in relationships that diminish her, and that's exactly what makes her so rare. Because in a world where so many are still trapped in emotional games, tactics to avoid seeming too needy, or manipulations to be more interesting, she simply is. No effort, no pretense, no performance. And this state of authenticity is magnetic, because it reveals a truth that needs no words. Jung said true love begins when the self recognizes itself in the other without losing its own identity. And the woman who's chosen herself lives this. She loves without abandoning herself. She gives without dissolving. And she withdraws when she sees the bond isn't mutual, not out of coldness, but maturity, because she's learned that staying where there's no room for truth is a way of betraying herself. She doesn't make a fuss when she leaves. She doesn't create scenes. She doesn't dramatize, because she's realized that a lack of reciprocity speaks louder than any excuse. And instead of trying to change the other, she chooses to protect her peace, because now she knows those who see come closer. Those who don't need convincing. This woman no longer seeks validation, because validation is no longer necessary. What she seeks is presence, clarity, truth, and above all, coherence. When she finds it, she stays. When she doesn't, she moves on, because now she no longer lives waiting to be chosen. She lives because she's already chosen herself. There's a strength that doesn't need to raise its voice or make speeches, a strength that doesn't impose itself but is felt. The woman who knows what she wants doesn't need to explain herself. She doesn't seek to convince or beg for understanding. She walks with a quiet conviction, and it's this serene firmness that transforms the space around her. Carl Jung said that when a person connects with the totality of their being, their presence begins to impact the collective, unconscious. And that's what this woman embodies. A presence that touches others without needing to reach out. She no longer gets lost in others' desires. She no longer drifts in vague promises. She's learned the difference between attention and presence, between desire and commitment, between pretty words and consistent actions. And having faced the pain of devaluing herself to be accepted so many times, she no longer surrenders her worth to fit into someone else's story. This clarity is unsettling, because in a world of emotional games, fragile relationships, and affective masks, a woman who doesn't play seems incomprehensible. She doesn't respond with strategic indifference. She simply doesn't persist. She doesn't drag out what's already shown itself to lack depth. And this rare attitude destabilizes those used to manipulating others' affection to feel secure. She's not in a rush, and she's not rushing because she's no longer chasing anything. When she enters a relationship, she observes, feels, listens to what's said and what's left unsaid. She notices where there's giving and where there's just performance. She doesn't delude herself with presences that only exist on the surface, and that's why she doesn't cling. She chooses. And this freedom to choose isn't arrogance. It's the result of rebuilding her dignity in silence. Contrary to what many think, this woman hasn't become cold. She's simply learned to protect her sensitivity. She feels and feels deeply, but no longer confuses intensity with reciprocity. She no longer sees absence as a cue to push harder, or indifference as a challenge to overcome. Now she knows love isn't proven, it's felt. And what isn't felt doesn't need to be forced. There's something in this stance that sparks an unexpected reaction in others, because the absence of neediness reveals a strength many don't know how to handle, an energy that doesn't submit, doesn't adapt to please, doesn't pretend to be okay when it's not. And that disarms, because this woman doesn't need anyone to exist. But when she chooses to be with someone, that choice carries weight, presence, truth. She doesn't seek completion in anyone, because she no longer feels incomplete. She seeks to share. And so, her affection isn't dependent, it's conscious. She loves with eyes wide open, feet on the ground, heart whole. And if it's not like that, she'd rather walk alone. And it's this strength that creates a new space in relationships, because beside her, the other realizes they can't toy with her time. They can't disappear and return as if nothing happened. They can't offer crumbs and expect devotion. This woman has set a new standard, and it doesn't matter if the other person is ready for it or not, because she no longer lives molding herself to fit. She lives from the truth she's built. This invisible strength isn't in arrogance or rigidity. It's in awareness, in self-knowledge, in the depth of someone who's lost herself so many times trying to be accepted and now simply chooses not to abandon herself anymore. She's not perfect, she's not untouchable, but she's real, and it's this emotional reality that transforms. When she walks away, it's not to manipulate, it's because she's learned that persisting is a way of hurting herself. When she falls silent, it's not to punish, it's because she no longer sees the point in speaking where there's no listening. When she gives up, it's not because she didn't feel, it's because she felt too much and wasn't met. And this stance doesn't come from pride, it comes from pain, from the pain she once felt for sidelining herself for shallow loves. And it's because she's known that emptiness that she no longer accepts it in her life. Her strength comes from the journey, from the path she walked to realize that true love starts within, not outside. This woman remains open to love, but now she no longer chases it, because she knows what's true doesn't need to be pursued, it just needs to be recognized. There comes a point in relationships where fantasy gives way to reality. It's at this moment that the enchantment can either break or transform. For Carl Jung, this point is revealing, because it's when projection begins to dissolve. What once seemed ideal, magical, perfect, starts to show its flaws, its limits, its humanity. And it's precisely at this juncture that true love can finally begin, or simply end. It all depends on how we handle the mirror that's handed back to us. Idealization in the early stages of a relationship is common. There's a natural tendency to see in the other what we unconsciously want to see. We project qualities, hopes, healing. We're not seeing the real person, but a mental construct that meets our deepest emotional needs. And often, the other does the same. Thus, two strangers fall in love with projections, not with each other. But this doesn't last. As intimacy deepens, the masks fall, and the other begins to reveal their true individuality, which often doesn't match what we expected. That's when conflicts arise, and with them frustration. Many interpret this as a sign that love is over. But for Jung, this could be the start of something more authentic, the meeting of two souls who now have the chance to see each other beyond the projection. Not everyone is ready for this, though. When the projection fades, many feel betrayed. They think the other has changed, when in reality, it's the veil of fantasy that's been torn. Instead of looking inward, they prefer to blame the other, abandon them, or start a new cycle with someone else, only to repeat it all again. This pattern isn't random. It's an escape from the inner work that love demands when it stops being an illusion and becomes a real encounter. The woman who stopped chasing has usually been through this cycle more than once. She's seen promising relationships crumble at the slightest hint of confrontation. She's blamed herself for feeling too much, expecting too much, wanting something that seemed so simple but proved impossible. Over time, she realized it wasn't about her. It was about how hard it is for many to love beyond projections, to see the other as they are, not as they wish them to be. She's learned that love only endures in presence. And presence isn't just physical proximity, it's emotional availability, to see and be seen. That takes courage, because looking at the other honestly also invites us to look at ourselves with the same clarity. And we don't always like what we see. True love is this mirror. It shows our neediness, our insecurity, our need for control, our struggle to trust. It exposes our wounds, not to punish us, but so we can finally heal them. That's why so many relationships break when the veil of idealization falls. It's easier to give up than to confront ourselves. The woman who stopped chasing no longer fears this mirror. She knows it's part of the journey. She knows there's no deep love without confrontation, without discomfort, without that moment when everything seems to collapse. And instead of running, she stays, not out of attachment, but because she knows this is where love stops being a dream and starts becoming truth. This stance is unsettling, because she no longer romanticizes suffering, but she doesn't flee from conflict either. She doesn't want perfect relationships, she wants real ones. And for that, she accepts the discomfort of being seen as she is and seeing the other as they are. This gaze, stripped of illusions, is what sets genuine love apart from fleeting passion. But this awareness doesn't make her numb. She still feels, she still gives, she still hopes. But now she knows what she's looking for, not a distorting mirror, but a reflection that reveals. Someone who, when seen, doesn't run, who can hold their own reflection and is willing to build a love that doesn't rely on idealization, but on the conscious choice to stay, even when everything proves imperfect. At this point, the relationship stops being a stage for expectations and becomes a space of truth. And those unwilling to face that truth will rarely stay, not because the love is gone, but because the idealization is. For some, that's enough to leave. For others, it's an invitation to truly stay. There's a quiet shift that happens when someone stops chasing love like it's a prize to be won. It doesn't come with fanfare or grand speeches. It happens within, in how you start to see yourself, how you position yourself with others, and most importantly, in what you begin to attract. Because when you stop chasing, something in your energy changes, and the kind of love that comes to you changes too. For a long time, the pattern was the same. You invested too much, expected too much, read meaning into signs that weren't there, accepted crumbs and called it patience. But at some point, that dynamic grew heavy. The emotional toll piled up. The exhaustion always outweighed what you received. And deep down, there was a void, masked as hope. Chasing didn't bring you closer to anyone. It only distanced you from yourself. When that exhausting pursuit ends, the inner movement shifts direction. Instead of projecting love outward and waiting for it to come back, you start drawing that energy back to yourself. Not selfishly or defensively, but with awareness. You realize that what you desperately sought in others was something you needed to nurture within. Validation, presence, care, respect, all of it begins to flow inward, and that changes everything. Carl Jung might say that when this shift occurs, the unconscious stops attracting repetitive patterns. Until then, it's as if you were seeking the same kind of relationship, the same recycled pain in different faces. When that unconscious repetition breaks, relationships stop being projections of neediness. They become real encounters. What you start attracting from this point isn't instant. It's not as if the right love knocks on your door the next day. In fact, it might feel like nothing's happening. There's silence, there's space, but instead of anguish, there's a new peace, a lightness that wasn't there before, because now there's no rush, no urgency. Love stops being a pursuit and becomes an inner state. The people who approach you at this moment sense this shift. They notice there's someone who doesn't need completing, someone who isn't begging for love with their eyes, someone who doesn't bend to be accepted. This stance draws a different kind of connection, not one that feeds on imbalance, but one born of reciprocity. You start to see that you don't need to prove your worth to be loved, that it's not your job to hold everything together alone. That giving should be light, not a constant effort to fit. This realization isn't just words. It's in the small choices, in how you say no, in how you don't push when you see the other's presence isn't whole. The energy you give off when you stop chasing is that of someone who's chosen themselves. And that changes the game. Until now, many approached because they saw you carried too much love and too few boundaries. The imbalance started there. Now, those who can't handle depth or real presence drift away naturally because they sense there's no more room for emotional games. You no longer need to shout to be heard or shrink to be accepted. Your presence speaks for itself, and that's what begins to attract, not through effort, but through the truth this energy carries. People who recognize themselves, who aren't looking for someone to fill their voids but to share a journey, who don't want to be saved or save anyone, but to walk side by side. This new dynamic doesn't guarantee every relationship will be perfect, but it ensures you won't abandon yourself to keep someone. Because when you stop chasing, you find yourself. And someone who's whole only attracts those who also want to build together. There's no more space for empty promises, only for true presence. When the search stops being a race and turns into presence, something emerges that once felt strange or even uncomfortable. Silence. Not the tense silence of running out of things to say, but the calm silence of those who don't need to prove anything, of those who are whole. It's in this kind of silence that space for something real is born. When two people meet without haste, without the urge to conquer or convince, the frequency of the relationship shifts. Gestures stop being rehearsed. Words stop being tactics. There's no rush to be answered, no fear of being forgotten. Each arrives with what they have, but doesn't feel the need to overdo it to be seen. At this point, love begins to breathe. This silence is also a reflection of emotional maturity, because contrary to what many think, it doesn't signal a lack of connection. It signals trust. Trust that the other is there not because they were persuaded, but because they chose to be. Trust that you don't need to always be in control for the relationship to exist. And above all, trust that you can simply be. Love born from silence doesn't demand performance. It doesn't require constant presence or instant replies. It doesn't need assurances, because it's understood that depth isn't measured by the frequency of messages, but by the quality of what's shared. The absence of emotional noise gives way to listening, to real attention, to respect for the other's timing. Carl Jung spoke of the importance of inner space, of retreat, of listening to the unconscious, and in a healthy relationship, this space must exist too, not as a lack of interest, but as a territory for growth. Because where there's no pressure, there's freedom. And where there's freedom, there's room for each to grow without suffocating the other. Many don't know how to handle this kind of silence. They're used to relationships where love must be constantly reaffirmed, where fear of abandonment demands endless proof. But that's a love that burns out fast. Love born from silence, on the other hand, strengthens over time because it's planted with deeper roots. Being beside someone who doesn't force, who doesn't invade, who doesn't demand explanations for everything is a kind of healing. Because in that presence, you learn not to force yourself, not to invade yourself, not to over-explain. You begin to see that true love is made of pauses too, and that pauses aren't signs of distance, but of respect. When two people are whole, the silence between them isn't empty. It's full of meaning. It's where wordless listening lives, the connection that doesn't need to be voiced all the time. It's in this calm gap that what truly matters reveals itself, the peace of being who you are without needing to chase, prove, or compensate, the peace of simply being. And it's in this slower, truer, more conscious rhythm that the relationship starts to take a different shape, not as a game of conquest, but as a safe space where both can rest from the world, a place where silence doesn't divide but unites, where there's no more fear of losing, because no one's trying to hold on, it's just flowing. True love doesn't show up making noise. It doesn't arrive to impress or to fill a space you haven't learned to inhabit. It doesn't demand promises or ask for guarantees. It simply recognizes, because real love doesn't need to justify itself, doesn't need to be forced, doesn't need to be chased. It just sees what was already ready to be seen. This kind of love doesn't appear when you're running after it. It comes when you stop, when you give up trying to convince someone to love you, when you let go of the illusion that you need to mold yourself to be accepted, when you realize no one can give you what you haven't yet allowed yourself to live. And it's in that quiet, subtle turning point that something shifts. You no longer feel the need to prove you're enough, because at last, you treat yourself as someone who is. You don't beg for attention because you're already attentive to yourself. You don't give until you're drained, because you've learned to respect yourself. And that's when the other changes too, because they see they're facing someone who doesn't falter, doesn't fade, doesn't shrink. Carl Jung said that the meeting of two people only becomes truly transformative when each has begun their own process of individuation, this journey of integrating all parts of oneself, even those repressed or denied for so long. When you stop chasing, that's exactly what starts to happen. You integrate, you see yourself whole, and that changes everything. The love born from this isn't neediness in disguise. It's not a desire for control. It's not an escape from loneliness. It's choice. Choice born of affinity, of harmony, of truth. It's when two people meet and don't need to complete each other because they've arrived whole. They don't need to fix each other because they've understood the other isn't there to fill a void, but to share a presence. This mutual recognition doesn't demand much. A glance is enough. A steady presence, even if silent, is enough. The security of being who you are, without fear of driving the other away, is enough. Because when love is true, it isn't rattled by your wholeness. It's drawn to it. At this point, love doesn't trap. It walks alongside. It doesn't demand. It welcomes. It doesn't try to shape the other into a mold. It celebrates the truth of who's standing there. Because there's no more room for games, manipulation, or illusions. There's only the reality of two beings who've chosen to walk together, not because they need to, but because they want to. True love begins when you stop chasing, because in that moment, you stop running from yourself. And that's exactly where the most powerful love of all takes root. One built from peace, not desperation, from presence, not absence, from awareness, not neediness. And that, Carl Jung knew, is where all transformation begins.